All right. It is, as we say in October, say it, the witching hour. It's 2:00. Welcome everyone to the October 13th presentation of Clayton Library Presents the last newspaper write-up, obituaries, and death notices with our colleague here at Clayton, Irene Walters. But before we get started, we are going to go through, if I can click on the slides. We've had a lot of technical difficulties today. Here are our upcoming webinars and our upcoming programs. This coming Friday, we are participating with the Waco McLennan Library up in Waco and the Central Texas Genealogy Society with Family History Month virtual showcase, all-day webinars. And with any of these presentations that we're looking at today, right here on this slide, you register for them just like you did for today. For October 15th, you will register, and then tomorrow we will be sending out a link to the web page where you'll be able to access those. I think it's 8 webinars on Friday. We have female ancestors. We have Thomas McKenty coming in and talking about Did I Get Everything? And then our morbid complimentary presentation on the final event, if you will want to say it's morbid, and then organizing your research. Everybody could do that after an entire month of family history presentations. And then of course our programming in November and December. And I would be remiss if I did not thank our team here at Clayton and at the Houston Public Library, Joy, Mitch, and Justin, for helping us put together these presentations. I just happen to be the MC. This would not happen if it was not for them. So those are our upcoming presentations. Oh, I forgot about our exciting flying bats. Ooh, ooh. Happy Halloween. We're open for research. Come and visit us Tuesday through Saturday, 10 to 4, or call us at 832-393-2600. Need a presentation? Call us and we can set you up with presentations. We have a lot of them. Irene is really good at doing presentations, as are a number of us. So do call us if you would like us to do a presentation. We have a list that we would be happy to send you. So let's see, on my run of show, I think I might have gotten everything. Oops. And right now we are going to bring Irene Walters, who is doing the last newspaper write-up, obituaries, and death notices. And Irene has been with us a lot of times for Clayton Library Presents. So she, I'm sure, not only through Clayton Library Presents, but probably in a lot of other ways, whether you've been here at the library or whether she has done presentations for you, for your group, you know Irene. But here is a short bio of her. She's been with the library since 1997. She's from New York. She received her librarian degree from the State University of New York at Buffalo. She talks all over various aspects of genealogical research, including computers, the internet, ancestors in the modern military, newspapers, knocking down brick walls, New York State, Irish, French research. She started her own genealogy when she was really young as a teenager and has taken her lines back to France, Ireland, and recently Germany. And unfortunately, her early Dutch ancestors have built a strong brick wall which she's chipping away at. So I am very happy to turn this over to Irene, and I know that we will learn stuff. And thank you so much, Irene, for doing this.
Thank you, Sue. Hello, everybody. I'm glad to see so many of you wanted to hear about obituaries and came today. So let me go ahead and share my screen. There. All right, now technical difficulties aside, let's get going with the last newspaper write-up, obituaries and death notices. So, as Sue said, I'm Irene B. Walters. I'm here at Clayton Library. And Clayton Library is part of the HPL library system, Houston Public Library System, whose mission statement is "We link people to the world." And here at Clayton, our unofficial slogan is that we are linking you to the world of your ancestors. And obituaries do link people to the world of their ancestors in very so many ways. So we're going to start with death notices. They are not necessarily what you think they are. And I'm going to talk about historical versus today with death notices and the length of death notices, short versus long, physical print versus online death notices, those written by an editor versus written by the family, and free death notices versus paid. So historically, death notices have been published statements that someone died or had a funeral. They were short and to the point. They were found in the newspaper or another publication like a church bulletin, and they were written by the newspaper or publication's staff, occasionally written by family, and they were free. On the right-hand side of my screen, I have a few different examples of death notices that we would recognize. Funeral of John Johnson was held at his home in Lionsdale Wednesday. Then a little column, a couple snips from a column of people who died, such as Hagel's in Holland Patton at the residence of her son, Joseph H. Turner, Mrs. Effie Hagel's in her 85th year. Bush at Kirshnerville, February 14th of consumption. Laney Bush, wife of Mies M. Bush, aged 27 years, 11 months, and 4 days. And then a record from a church write-up, the annual report of St. Stephen's Church, Croghan, 1921, of the various people who died that year and how old they were when they died. So those are what we historically think of when we hear the words death notices, these short little statements, not a lot of genealogy information in them, but some, and hopefully something that you did not know before you found the death notice. A death notice today could either be the term death notice today can either stand for a short write-up or a longer biographical write-up. They're still found in the newspaper or church bulletin, but also in other print sources or online. They are also found on funeral home or a mortuary's website, and they can be written by family members or the funeral home staff. Usually, today, they're very seldom written by the staff of the newspaper or the publication that they're found in, unless it's, excuse me, the funeral home or mortuary's website. Most of the time today, they are paid for. It's very seldom that you find them for free. And so we have some that Lisa Wooden Beerwinkle, where it's obviously from the funeral home, the Woodlawn Funeral Home. Sometimes in the newspaper, you still see them saying, being called a death notice and being a short record, such as Thelma Holcombs and Marion L. Davenport. Both are being called death notices. Those are from newspapers across the country, one from a newspaper in New York and one, Thelma Holcombs. One was from here in Houston in the Chronicle. But you can also have a longer death notice in these days, such as this one for James H. McFadden. So we have all of this information about Mr. McFadden, and it kept going. And that leads to the link to the Buck Funeral Home, which takes you over, and you can have multiple pictures on the funeral home website. You can have an obituary, things like that. So you the words death notice do not always mean what you think they mean. Mr. McFadden's obituary on the funeral home website, it's a little bit shorter than the first one we saw that was technically from a newspaper's website. But it has a lot of the same information. Some of the information is a little different. And obituaries have changed too. We'll also talk about the historical obituaries versus today's, the length of the obituary, where you find it, if it's physical print or online, if they're written by an editor versus the family, and what charge there might be. So historically, the word obituary historically stood for the published biographical article that someone died, such as the two. Those are two separate obituaries on the right. They were usually longer with more details. They might ramble about the person with details that are not necessarily biographical, genealogical. They could be details about their religion, prayers, things like that. Historically, they were usually found only in a newspaper or some published source. They were written by the newspaper staff or the family. So most of the time, historically, information was given to someone on the newspaper staff for them to be written up. They could be written up by the funeral home, the mortician at the funeral home, but sometimes they were written up by the family. And historically, depending on the size of the obituary, they could be free, and it depends on the size of the newspaper, what the policy was for that newspaper. But longer obituaries might have been paid for even back in the 1800s. We think usually when we're talking about obituaries that, oh, back in the 1800s or 1700s, early 1900s, that an obituary would have been free, but not necessarily. I've seen where they were in the beginning of the 1900s, it was 6 cents a line. So a line across the column. So for the first one, Mrs. Catherine L. Bush, 95, widow, that would have been 6 cents. Of Frank L. Bush, died suddenly at, another 6 cents. So it wasn't 6 cents per sentence. It was per line in the paper. Today, the word obituaries usually still stands for a published biographical article that someone died. There are some places that consider the short little, what we historically viewed as a death notice is an obituary, and what we historically viewed as an obituary is a death notice. There's some places that flip the terms, but we still, most of the time, obituaries are still the published article about someone. They are usually still longer with more details. They might ramble. This one about Francine Hellerman, sorry. It talks about where she taught and what type of classroom she had. It was second grade again, different schools, second and fourth grade. So, but this one was in a newspaper from the area that she lived in. This was a kind of short obituary overall, because there's just the fact that she was a longtime teacher in the North Belmore schools, died on June 4th. It doesn't give us anything about who her family was or anything. It just, she's survived by her husband and her 2 children, but no information about them. Obituaries today might be found on a website that is for a newspaper or for some other published source, or the website for a funeral home. Gilbert Gilly Stoffel's obituary is from on the website for the funeral home, and you click on it, gives you more information about him, and just keeps going. An obituary today could be free. It depends on the paper, such as this, We Need Your Help. The Springs Echo and the Rose Ladies were creating obituaries for homeless people. And the Springs Echo is a mission. It's the Springs Rescue Missions newspaper. So they were putting information in for free, but they needed people to give them the information and to write up the information. So the obituaries today are usually are paid for. They could be free. They're written by funeral home staff or family, or in this case, since it's about homeless people, it could be written about a homeless person by another homeless person, the information that they knew about them. So, death notices and obituaries. Terms are sometimes interchangeable. Some other terms that may be used, I'll be going over what medium you'll find them in, when were they written and published, where to find them, and how to find them. So, as interchangeable terms, some newspapers and newspaper websites use either term. Some of them actually use both terms on the same site, but obituaries is still the more common term for the biographical write-up about someone. Other terms that can be used that you might find are death announcements, life tributes, memorials or in memoriams, testimonials, funeral announcement, burial announcement, or necrology. Technically, a necrology is a listing of people who died that are related to whatever the source of the necrology is listed in. So it could be, if it was a magazine of veterans, it could be a list of the veterans that had died in the past month or the past year. If it's a church newspaper, could be a list of the priests or preachers who had died in the last year, things like that. So you get different types of things. You get small information about people in a necrology. You usually get a year, a name, a date, and a place, such as the snippet of the necrology at the bottom from the Hobart Herald. You can get facts, that just the fact that somebody died and there's going to be a funeral announcement later with more information. You may get a whole, what we would want to call an obituary in the paper. So what medium can you find obituaries in? You can still find them in physical print. The newspaper itself still has them. You might find them as clippings from the newspaper. You might not find the whole newspaper every page, but you might find physical clippings. And we, as genealogists, pretty much all probably have some sort of clipping shoebox or file folder that has things that are obituaries, wedding announcements, whatever, clipped out, times that the family was in the newspaper, clipped out. I have personally, doing my genealogy, I do have what I call my Marie Bush Walters newspaper clipping file. And it's all of these clippings that my mom had clipped out of the newspaper that I am gradually putting into my family tree software. You might find the newspaper on microfilm. You might find a digitized copy of the physical newspaper or the microfilm of the newspaper. And you may find the obituary published online, so that the very first place that the obituary is, instead of making it onto a physical paper page, you might find it first online, and then or it might only be online. And online could be at a newspaper website, a funeral home website, or some other websites that I will be showing you in a few minutes. When was the obituary itself written, and when was it published? Usually they are written soon after the death, sometimes within hours, sometimes within minutes, usually within hours or days, unless it was for a famous person. The article, the clipped article on the right, is talking about it's Waiting Till Men Die, life history of prominent people always kept in readiness. That this was from in the right around 1900. It was an article in a Denver newspaper where they talked about editors of various newspapers would keep a clipping file on famous people and have it ready to go at any minute if something happened and the person died. So most of us don't have that type of obituary or death notice written about our relatives and ancestors. So ours are usually written soon after they died, and all the information is gathered at that point. When they are actually published depends on the publication schedule of the medium that it is published in. They could be published on the day of death. Sometimes you get just a death notice in a historic newspaper where the information gets to the newspaper office just before the newspaper is put to bed and printed. So they quick put in a little bit that, oh, we've learned that John Johnson died. It could be after the funeral that they found out at the newspaper office just after the newspaper was actually printed for the day, or after it was put to bed. And so by the time the next issue of the paper came out, it could be a week later if it was a weekly newspaper, and the funeral had already happened and they had already been buried. Most of the time when you are looking for an obituary, you usually want to look within 2 weeks of the death. Most newspapers were published daily or weekly. There were some that were published monthly, but those are a little more obscure. They're not your regular newspaper. They may be a church paper or something like that. So those are the ones that I personally kind of consider the non-news sources that might publish them monthly or annually, if you find it in a source other than the newspaper. Where were they published? Physically, they were published a lot of times in newspapers, as I said, church bulletins, and society journals. Think about the various societies that your ancestors might have been in. Here on my images, We have the American Psychiatric Association member obituaries. We have JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, which kept a file of obituaries for doctors who died, and the official journal of the 18th Annual Congress of the Texas Daughters of the American Revolution. The ladies who belong to the DAR in Texas, their write-ups about their death, it might only be just a necrology or a death notice, the fact that they had died in the last year, or it might be a full obituary if they were an officer in the society. So look for those too. Don't just think newspapers for obituaries, or newspapers or funeral homes for obituaries. You can find them published online in newspaper websites, funeral home websites, society websites, such as the American Psychiatric Association. That was right off of their website. It wasn't their actual journal like the JAMA or the Texas DAR, and other websites. Where to find the physical print copies? In libraries is a very good chance that you might find the newspaper still in paper form. Not always, but sometimes they still have them in paper form. But in libraries, they might also have compiled books of obituaries. We have quite a few here at Clayton. You can search obituaries and the county name that you are looking for obituaries in. You can also search obituaries and the state name and see what we have. You might find them in the various society journals that, like we have here at Clayton, the various genealogy society journals, other society journals, the oil and gas company journals, things like that. And clipping files. There are a lot of libraries. Clayton Library is not one that keeps a full clipping file from the newspaper, because we never received the newspaper here at Clayton. There are some clipping files kept downtown at the Houston Metropolitan Research Center, or HMRC. There may be some obituaries in those. It is not a just obituary, or it's not an obituary clipping file. It's clippings about various people, but you will find some obituaries in there if the person was a little bit more famous. You can also find all of these at some historical societies, and sometimes you can find the physical print of the newspaper at a newspaper office or archives. Where to find the microfilm? It could be a library, a local university or state library. You also might find them in historical societies that will own newspaper microfilm or journal microfilm. And some newspaper offices will have microfilm of their newspapers. It's not as likely at the newspaper offices to find the paper copies or the microfilm of the newspapers, but some of the larger ones will have that. Where to find digitized copies of older journals, newspapers, so forth, are on different paid and unpaid databases, straight on websites that may be free to be able to find it, and some email lists or newsletters. You may get an email, be on an email list of alumni from a university or your high school, or you might get a newsletter from an organization that you belong to that will have it might come as an e-newsletter, and it might have a digitized copy of an obituary in it. Ones that are actually published online, like I said, look for newspaper websites. So I would Google newspaper and the name of the town that you're looking for, and make sure you put the name of the state on there, because there's a lot of towns Even if you think it's an unusual town name, it might be in another state because it might be based on Native American words or something like that. Look for the funeral home websites. I would Google funeral home and the town again in the state. Look for the societies websites that you know they belong to, especially if they died more recently, and see if there's an obituary on that. Look for the alumni websites, see what it has about people who died who had were alumni of that school, and specialized obituary websites. Now, what do I call a specialized obituary website? Legacy.com, obits.org, dignitymemorial.com, tributes.com, cindyslist.com/obituaries, ecovita.com/ca, which is a Canadian obituary website, and obitsarchive.com, which is a paid site. All of the ones above obitsarchive.com are unpaid. You can go on there and you can look for obituaries. Legacy.com and dignitymemorial.com are actually related to the funeral home industry, and they are both funeral homes today have used some different software to actually put the information about their funeral home and their obituaries online. And it depends on which software they're using if you would find the obit in legacy.com or dignitymemorial.com. Legacy.com also works and pulls obits from newspaper websites, it gets linked from the newspaper website. So you have different places that you can find the obituary websites online. Now, how to find some historic obituaries and death notices. Make sure you search the print or microfilm of newspapers. That is pretty much the first place you want to look for an obituary is in the newspapers. And to search it, you might have to take a road trip to the holders of the newspaper, but you might also be able to get it on interlibrary loan. So try that to see if you can get it on interlibrary loan. And we are doing interlibrary loan here at Clayton Library. You can get, if you find a newspaper microfilm somewhere, we can try to get it for you as long as you have a Houston Public Library MyLink library card and it is in good standing. You want to search digitized newspapers for those historic obituaries and death notices using free websites such as Portal to Texas History, the Colorado Historic Newspapers, New York State Historic Newspapers. Use library databases and subscription databases. And don't forget that some libraries and societies have lookup services where they do obituary lookups. Some genealogy societies across the country will look for an obituary in their local newspaper. Some libraries will look them up also. Houston Public Library, because the Houston Chronicle microfilm and the Houston Post microfilm are at the main library building downtown, does do a library or a library lookup for obituaries, and you just request it through the Houston Public Library website. You don't have to request them from Clayton because we don't do them. We don't look at the microfilm. We don't have it. So it's you look at it down. The staff look at it downtown for the obituary lookups, and it's a minimal charge if they find it. How to find a modern obituary or death notice. And for modern, I'm considering around the last 25 years might be a couple of years before that. You might not be able to find something that's 20 years old. You have to try them. Still look in the newspaper, physically, the newspaper or the microfilm, but also search the digitized newspapers. Some newspapers, some historic newspapers, as they've been digitized, some have been digitized right up till the last few years. Some it is only what is in public domain, so up to 1923, 24. Search actual newspaper websites because sometimes those newspaper websites keep everything in an archive on their site. So if the obituary for somebody was from 25 years ago, it may be in the newspaper's archive on their site. Also search local news websites. I have found some obituaries on the sites for the broadcast news, CBS, ABC, so NBC, so forth. So it's usually those are on smaller towns and out in the country versus you're not going to necessarily find them on a Houston city the size of Houston's local news website unless it was a prominent person. Search the funeral home websites. A lot of funeral homes that have been around for a while started getting into the computers and started getting into putting a website up around 1995, 96, 97, 25 years ago and so forth. So you may find, and some of those funeral home websites do have all the obituaries from when they started. Some have in the earliest years, they only had 2 or 3 maybe obituaries per year up online because the family didn't want to pay for that type of stuff. They were like, well, none of us have computers. We don't get on the internet. We don't need it online. And so they didn't pay for it necessarily on the funeral home. Again, search society websites and alumni websites and those obituary websites I talked about. And something, if you are from a small area, a small town like I'm from, you can actually sign up for the individual funeral homes emails, and they will send you an email when they post a new obituary, or they've depends on how that particular funeral home does it. If they send you one a week or one every day, or, every time someone dies and goes through the funeral home. But you can get notices, and this really only works if you're from a small town where you might have 1 or 2 funeral homes for the town. If you're from, I would not want to try to get get a notice for every funeral that goes through a funeral home in a city like Houston. We have too many funeral homes in Houston. In the first place, you'd have to have a dedicated email just to receive them. But check your group email lists and newsletters to see if those have obituaries. So your alumni association from your high school, your society group, your whatever type of group, your HOA, if there is something that lists an obituary. Now, finding online sites for historic newspapers. Houston Public Library has a bunch of newspaper databases, and what you do is go to the Houston Public Library's website, houstonlibrary.org, and you want to do the all databases search. So you can click on research and all databases, or you can type the website in that I've given you, you want to click on the category search tab and then click on the newspapers category. I will warn you, this might slightly change in within the next month or two, but you should still be able to get the all databases and the various categories, and there will be a newspaper category. Houston Public, we're changing our website for getting into the databases just slightly. We're trying to make it even easier than it is at the moment. Some of the newspaper databases you might find at Houston Public Library or other libraries are things like the 19th Century U.S. Newspapers Digital Archive. That is one that Houston Public Library pays for. Accessible Archives and America's Historical Newspapers, we do not pay for. Fold 3 is a mostly military database, but there are a bunch of newspapers from that Fold 3 had digitized and put in there before it moved more towards just military. Newspaper Archive. Newspaper Archive is one that the Houston Public Library pays for. We have currently the basically the Gulf Coast regional section, or the south, it's more of the southeast America region. Some libraries and societies pay for the full US subscription to Newspaper Archive, and it does have, on the full one, it does have newspapers from all over the country. Right now we have the regional with Houston Public Library. And the various ProQuest historical newspapers. There are some that are specifically African American, some that are specifically Hispanic. So you want to look and see what does your library, since we have people here from all over the country, what does your library pay for under something like the ProQuest historical newspapers? Which ones do they have, you have access to from your library? And then check out to see if the universities around you will allow you to use their databases in any way. Because a lot of times university libraries have access to newspaper databases, and they may have different access than your local library has, and you might be able to get into a few more using theirs. Actual sites that you can pay for access to historic newspapers are like findmypast.com. They have British, English, Irish newspapers. They also actually have a collection of US newspapers on findmypast.com. Now, what the Houston Public Library has for our findmypast.com subscription does not have access to all of the newspapers in Find My Past. It's the one section of Find My Past that we don't have access to all of it on, but there are some newspapers that are available in our subscription. Fold3.com. Again, the library can pay for a subscription. You can pay for a subscription to Fold3 and get to the newspapers. Genealogy Bank, newspaperarchive.com, and newspapers.com are three of the major newspaper databases that you can go into, that you can buy your own subscription to. Houston Public Library does not have a subscription to any of those. They can be quite expensive for a library to get. Some of them you can do access, pay for access for a month or 3 months or 6 months or a year. And they have newspapers from all over. When I am wanting to get into a section of the country that I don't do a lot of research in, I will pay for a short-term access to the newspaper. And before I pay for it, I will do a list of who I'm looking for, what I'm looking for, so that I can maximize my time in the databases, newspaper databases, so I can search for in that 3-month period that I have the subscription, I can get as much information as possible. MyHeritage.com is also a database that the Houston Public Library pays for, and we have access to that, and we do have access to the newspapers in there. They do not necessarily have a huge collection of newspapers in there, but they do have some, and they have links to indexes to a bunch of stuff in newspapers. Like they have a link to an index to obituaries in the Houston Post on myheritage.com. To find web links to historic newspapers, especially those that you can get into for free, look at the Library of Congress's Chronicling America website. Look at Google News All Newspapers. Google itself did digitize a lot of newspapers, and they are a lot of them are searchable so that you can go in. Sometimes if you know about when the death occurred, they're not all perfectly searchable, but you can go in and narrow down to that time period and that 2-week time period, and then sit there and read the historic newspaper until hopefully you find the obituary. The website Small Town Newspapers has newspapers that were for very small towns across the whole country. It's a dual site where they have information from the newspapers right now and historic. So it's a good one to look to see if there's anything for your particular town. Now, the Ancestor Hunt blog, the gentleman who does that website does a phenomenal job of keeping up with newspapers, newspaper research links. And if you go to that particular page on his site, you can then pick the state that you want the newspaper from and look down through, and he will tell you for a lot of them if they're on Genealogy Bank or newspapers.com, or if they're on a specific site like Chronicling America or New York State Historic Newspapers. Cindy's list, she does this, she does some also. Hers is not, because she does so many things like that. Her newspaper one is not quite as robust as the Ancestor Hunt blog, but hers has some great ones also. To find even more digitized historic newspapers, if so far you haven't been able to find it using Ancestor Hunt, Chronicling America, or whatever, or the other sites, go ahead and do an internet search of the words digital newspapers and then your state, county, or town to see what comes up, because it just might be that it's a new site that they've put, that they've digitized the historic papers on and put it up online that the other places have not figured out is there, and put it on their put a link on their site. You can also Google, or using Bing, Google, Yahoo, whatever, historical newspapers online, and then your state or county or town. And remember that some of the newspapers could be in more than one site or database. So my hometown newspaper is actually digitized in, I believe, at least 3 different site, 2 free sites and at least 1 of the paid sites. And part of it, the part that is on the paid site is part that has not been digitized on the free sites. So you want to look at what their coverage is on the various sites and see if you got just 1 issue of the paper happens to be on the site, or 50 years or 100 years, how much is on there. To actually find those more modern online obituaries, you can do an internet search for obituaries and then your state or county or town. You can try actually the word obituary and your relative's name. If you do that, I would also add either the year or the town to pull it up. And again, remember that the same newspaper could be on more than one site or database. And actually, an obituary itself may be in more than one newspaper or place. So sometimes they get reprinted and put in other places. What do you find in the record? Or what will you find in the record? The stats and stories. You might just find that minimal notice or a bit, and I'm going to talk about some minimal ones, some medium-sized ones, some large-sized death notices or obituaries, multiple death notices or obituaries, and some reprinted death notices or obituaries. So the minimal notice, hopefully you're going to get at least their name, their date of death, something about either the funeral or their burial. What day is the funeral, where were they buried, something like that. Sometimes you'll get a bit more. So I have some different options here. So you have to read when you find it in a historic newspaper, read and see what is the area that you're finding it in. So the funeral of John Johnson held at his home in Lionsdale Wednesday. That one and the obits, the information below it, all of those came from town columns in the newspaper where we jokingly call them the town gossip columns. And it's the information about what is held or what has happened in that town in the last week or so. Mrs. Julia A. Johnson, mother of Adam Johnson. So we got a little bit more information about Julia, not just her name. Aged 81 years. So great, we got an age for her. Died Monday of last week. So we have to look at the newspaper's date of publication to figure out what that date would be. The funeral services were held on Thursday and Reverend A.J. Felshaw officiating. So if we look up and try to find what church Reverend A.J. Felshaw might have been the pastor for in that town, we can try to figure out using that information, what religion Mrs. Julia A. Johnson is. Now, she was actually the wife of John Johnson, the one above that. And so, by the time she died, the family gave a little more information to the newspaper, but not much more. The next one down, on Saturday occurred the funeral of John C. Bush. The deceased was 88 years of age. Then we have a gossip snippet for somebody else. And then the next one, Joseph Bush and Dr. G. Kilburn of Forestport were in town recently. Well, knowing the genealogy, Joseph Bush is the son of John C. Bush, and Dr. G. Kilburn is Joseph Bush's son-in-law. And so they were in town for John C. Bush's, possibly his death, but definitely in town for his funeral. So you got different information. The one on the snippet on the left-hand side was actually from the end of the year coroner's reports, where the coroner wrote up what he had done over the course of the year so he would get paid by the county for what he had done. And so on June 5th, 1898, was called to inquire into the death of Michael Strife of New Bremen, found death due to natural causes, did not call either medical witnesses or jury. So my great grandpa, Michael Strife, not Smith. I said Smith before. It's Michael Strife of New Bremen. So now I know he died of natural causes. because I may or may not find his death certificate. But now I know that he died of natural causes. So we get some different information, even in the just straight died columns. We get a little bit more information sometimes than um, just date of death or funeral. Now, medium size death notices or obituaries, we don't always get what we want. We should, of course, get the name and date of death. We might get, hopefully, the funeral information, burial information, their age or birth date. Sometimes it gives us that they were, 89 years, 6 months, and 2 days. So we can figure out their birth date. Sometimes it just gives us an age. Hopefully something about the cause of death, hopefully some relatives information, religious affiliation or biographical information. Well, we got Mrs. John Bibbins in the first obit here. She departed life Saturday evening, and and then she'd gradually been sinking, and she closed her eyes as the day closed. So she closed her eyes to earth and opened them on the bright eternal shores in the morning. And it goes on about, what a good Christian she was, and the singing praises of God and like that. So we don't end up getting any information about her family or anything else. We just barely get that she was 69 years old and 11 months. And we get a little bit up atop from her funeral was held from the residence of her daughter, Mrs. Charles Denning. So, sometimes it looks like, oh, wow, this is a nice obit. And then you read the whole thing and you're like, oh, I didn't get much more than the minimal obit. Sometimes the smaller ones give us quite a bit of information. Peter Love summoned, it talks, even in that short, or medium-sized one, it talks about where he lived, different places that he lived, different counties that he served in the Civil War. He was a member of the Reynolds Post GAR, Grand Army of the Republic, and of the Methodist Church. So we get a whole bunch of stuff crammed together in a medium-sized notice or obituary. And then the large size death notices or obituaries. Hopefully we get everything that you could get in a medium-sized one, but you also usually in the larger ones get something about their illness, not always, but more information about a military career, something maybe about their political leanings or their character. So we have different ones here. These are between medium and long. We have born in the middle one, Nicholas Muth, was born in Lorraine, France in 1833, being 82 years, 11 months, and 18 days of age. Left his native country in 1863. So, hey, we got immigration information. Has been a resident of Belfort since that time. When he got united in marriage and to who with her maiden name. And information about all the kids and so forth. So you get different information. Some of them, the first one that you can see the American flag behind, that one was actually a huge one. It looks really small there, and the print's real small because I just had to shrink it down to show it. But it was an online obit that was across my whole screen. So it was quite long and quite a bit of information. Now, multiple death notices or obituaries, you may find the same person in multiple newspapers if your town or county had multiple newspapers. This is 3 different obits for Nicholas Courts, who died, from 3 different newspapers, one of which was the middle one was on the first page of the newspaper. The other 2 were on like page 5 of the newspaper. all three of them give us slightly different information about Nicholas Quartz. The third one gives us information right in the headline that he died of diabetes. The other two don't say anything about his illness and what he died of. He was a soldier in the Civil War. He was from France, and so you got quite a bit of information about Mr. Quartz. But to get the full picture of him, you had to get all three obituaries because each one has at least something that is not in the other two. The obituary that you find might be reprinted from another paper that you can't find online, or so forth. Like this obituary for the Joseph Bush who had come to town for his dad, John C. Bush's funeral. When he died, it was the following item from Forestport in the Utica Press of Monday will be of interest to the many friends and relatives of Joseph Bush, a former well-known resident of this village. And then it talks about him and his life. And I have not been able to find in the Forestport, any paper from Forestport or Utica Press obit for Joseph Bush, but I have it from the Journal and Republican in Lewis County, New York. The Utica Press of New York and Forestport both are Oneida County, so it's a whole different county even. You want to watch, though, in the obituaries, don't take every bit of information they give you for gospel. Watch out for mistakes, the wording of names, additional information that might be elsewhere. So watch for misspellings and typos. In the Mrs. Marianne Hill Smith, her two daughters listed, it's Mrs. Burl Walter is what it should be. It says Mrs. Burl Waters. And Mrs. Zotique Prue, it has Mrs. Votique and then Prelix instead of Prue. Those are wrong misspellings of the daughters' names. The dates and ages could be wrong. The places may be wrong. Marianne Hill was not just born in Donegal, Ireland. It should say Donegal County because she was from a tiny little townland in Ireland. That is not her. Her daughters would insist that she was from Donegal as if it was the city of Donegal. And I have since found no, she's from a small townland that doesn't even have a crossroad. It is a place so small the road just goes through it, and that's it. There could be family members missing. Mrs. Wilhelmina Walter on the right-hand side, it says she had 2 sons and 3 daughters survive her, Charles Walter, Fred Walter, and then Mrs. George Rumble and Mrs. Joshua Verkler and Mrs. Loeffler. Well, Mrs. Loeffler, it doesn't even say what Mr. Loeffler's first name was, but she actually had 3 sons who survived her. My great-grandpa, William F. Walter, was still alive when his mom died. So I don't know. I mean, it has the 2 sons and it has the asterisks after Fred Walter of New Bremen. I don't know if that meant they were going to double check and see if there was more. And they just, oops, put it in the paper that way or what. But sometimes people are missing, misspelled, and so forth. And you want to watch for the wording of names. Again, Mrs. Verl C. Walter of Casterland, Mrs. Ernest Cowles, or actually I should have put that as Mrs. Ernest L. Cowles in Joseph Reuben Smith's obituary. Well, his wife's obituary, when she died, it turned it into Mrs. Verl Waters, and it did get Cowles right, Ernest L. Cowles, correct, but some of the names changed because it added in the Joseph's obit, the only two children that were married were Mrs. Verl Walter and Mrs. Ernest Cowles. In his wife's obit, almost all of the girls had been married. So all of a sudden, the girls who were single in dad's obit are now married and moms. And look, when you are looking at the daughters in a family in their obits, when it lists them, for the most part, if it lists them as like Mrs. Martha Strong, Mrs. Laura Murphy, and Mrs. Cecilia Kerfin, double check that the other daughters are listed with their husbands' names. If they're listed like Mrs. Henry Bush in the Martha, Laura, and Cecilia's sister, Mrs. Henry Bush, which would be Mrs. Frances Bush, she and her husband were both still alive. Well, Martha's husband had died, Laura's husband had died, and Cecilia's, we thought they listed it as if he had died. We found out he was in the insane asylum. So, it, but looking at the names, how did they write them over time can change. Daughters' names can be written as Mrs. Henry, then Frances in parentheses Bush, or it could be Mrs. Frances and then Henry in parentheses Bush. That is a slightly more common. You're going to find that in the last 10, 15 years. But you will find it in historic ones. You're going to find it like this. The daughters usually listed under their husband's names, unless they are widowed, and then they get to be put in with their own first name and the husband's last name. Compare the family members like I've been doing with Joseph Reuben Smiths and Marianne Hill, who's listed, who's not. On Marianne Hill's, the daughter Mabel that was on Joseph's, she's not listed at all. It's not really, she's not listed because of a mistake. She had died, and a lot of times the children who had died do not get listed in historic obituaries. Watch for other information, such as in the same paper, in the same issue, Mr. and Mrs. Frank L. Bush and son Anselm and Mrs. Margaret Higby left for Forestport Saturday to attend the funeral of their brother Joseph Bush. So in the same paper, sometimes on the same page, sometimes on a different page, you can have an obituary and then information about people who attended the funeral. If the funeral was in another town or people came into town from out of town to attend the funeral. The Nicholas Quartz dies of diabetes. It was found in another newspaper of the same town. And the obituary, especially the newer ones that you find online and in the physical newspaper, they might be slightly different because you might not have to pay as much to put it online as you do in the paper. So, you know, whatever the costs are, people are going to pay them slightly differently. So what you need to do is find your family's obituaries before they fade away and share them. Share them using your genealogy software, your shared or shareable databases, such as ones that are on ancestry.com or familysearch.org. Also look in ancestry.com and familysearch.org and see if relatives, your cousins have found an obituary and put it on there. The example over on the right is the obituary for Mary A. Hogel's, wife of Sylvester Hogel's, that someone else put on Family Search, and Sylvester is my let me get it right, my great grandma's brother. So that was one of his 3 wives' obituaries. You might want to share it using a family newsletter or on the internet, using a blog, using Facebook, or create a book or booklet of those newspaper clippings and obituary clippings that you find. And so some final points to ponder: get copies of obituaries. You might find information you did not know anywhere else. You might already know all of it, but you don't know until you look and find it. Remember to document your sources. To, what newspaper did you find it in? What page is it on? What's the date of the newspaper? It does kind of help you write down if it says it's the Thursday, July 15th, 1927 newspaper, that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, the day of the week can help you. Reread them to see if a new find will shed more light on your tree. You might already have the obituary, and then you start looking at something else and go, what else can I find? When I found Peter Love's obituary, it said he was survived by one son, his wife, his one son, Hubert E. Love, and one daughter, Mrs. Warren King, and a brother, Judson Love, who lives in Rochester. Well, I knew Peter and Eliza had a son, Herbert or Herman. It flips back and forth for his name, and a daughter, Minnie, but I didn't know who Minnie married until I found her dad's obit. Then I went back to the census and realized that 1880 census, or whichever year it was, not 1880, 1900 census, that Minnie King was living right next door to her mom and dad. So it shed new light on the obituary shed new light on my information. And remember, with obituaries, to have fun looking for them. You can get some really interesting write-ups about people. You find, as you are scanning the newspaper to find other information or to find the obituary itself, you can find other things about what was going on in the county, what was important to everybody. And it is fun to do. So get copies of obituaries, document your sources, reread them, have fun. That has been the last newspaper write-up, Obituaries and Death Notices, from Clayton Library, Irene Walters. Remember, we are open Tuesday through Saturday, 10 to 4 for researchers and for telephone reference. And we would love to see you come in. We would love to talk to you on the phone to help you find your obituaries for your ancestors. So come on by. And I'm going to stop my sharing.
Great, Irene, thank you. That was, it was wonderful. As always, I mean, there's even already a comment in the chat about the handout. I mean, handouts are your thing, and as are presentations. So
thank you.
I learned a lot. I love the way you present it, and you do a great job. And I'm glad that you did mention beyond the big guys. I call the big guys the newspapers.com and things like that, and getting down into that level where doing that research, like you talked about putting out in the Google page and things like that, searching for the library or things like that. The Quincy Public Library in Illinois is an example of a public library that has their newspapers digitized through them rather than one of the subscription sites or something like that. So that's good. And then let's talk about, just really quickly, we have some questions that Mitch will get to, but either writing your obituary or some of the more humorous obituaries. I know that when my father died, he was a judge, and the first line was, Howard Kaufman went to the big courthouse in the sky, so some of them can be humorous and informative.
We here at the library, when someone brings in the newspaper, the Houston Chronicle and like that, and we're looking at it, we kind of joke like, oh, you can tell there's a genealogist in that
Right.
family helped write that obit, because there's all sorts of information. And but yeah, you get some interesting things. Like we had to, because so many people knew my dad as Gutsy Walters. They knew his nickname. They didn't know his name was Burl Carl. Um, we actually had to put Gutsy in the obituary so that people knew who it was who died.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. That's
and
so. There's other examples. I mean, like you mentioned, we've seen some, and I think you brought up a good point. Is it's important to do that because, like, people that are reading obituaries might not have known your father as Verl, but they did know him as Gutsy. So the information that goes into them, that comes back to maybe writing your own journal, your obituary. Sometimes when I read the biographies, whether it's yours or mine, these are almost like obituaries before the presentations. So we call these obituary credits,
what
sometimes when we read those.
Well,
So
I hope my obituary has a little more information than that, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to have to write it myself to make sure it gets accurate and is in there, because I'm not sure everybody in my family could state exactly which college I went to when I got my degree and so forth.
well, that brings up a big point, because in my father's obituary, I mentioned that he was an Eagle Scout. And I had found out since then, after I wrote it and it was published, and I, for the money that I paid for it, and also, he never really made Eagle. He didn't finish his project. So, so that's right. So think about writing your own obituary so you get things correct, or what you would like to get across. Here's my obituary. You can leave it with everything. Let's bring in Mitch and see what kind of questions we have. Mitch.
Hello. Hi, Irene. That was
Hello.
really great. Really enjoyed that. Thank you so much.
Mhm. And you
do you have
helped me with a little bit too.
Yes.
You gave my fellow colleagues here at Clayton, I got some information from different ones for it. So thank you for the information you gave me about
Hey, we're a team,
alumni
right?
associations and stuff. Yep, we're a team.
Mhm. So I do have a couple of
Okay.
questions here.
Okay.
Catherine has a question. She asks, how long are funeral home death notices available on the web? Is there any kind of a standard or anything like that that you know of?
I have no, I have not. I do not know of a standard. Most of them that I find, it depends, I think, on how big the funeral home is and how long it's been in business. If you have one that doesn't deal with a lot of obituaries and a lot of funerals each month or each day, those ones tend to keep them up for a long time, or almost like right from when they started the website on, and have all of them that they've ever put up on. Some of them, if it is a funeral home that is handling a lot of funerals per day, per month, that they might only be up for a couple of years. But most of them that I've seen, it's at least a couple of years that you can find it on there. And some of them you can just straight Google um, and search for the name and you'll find it, but without having to actually search that particular funeral home site. But the ones that I use, since I'm from originally, and most of my relatives are from counties with much smaller populations than Houston. I find on those type of counties that you're going to have them on for years. I've found ones that are 10, 15, 20 years old on those.
I found one just this morning. I did some research and found one from 2007 on a newspaper site.
Mhm.
An online newspaper site, not like an archive site. So yeah, it was still active.
Yeah.
I think we're still kind of in the early years of online postings, and compared to how long
Mhm.
newspapers and stuff go back. So we're still trying to figure all this stuff out, I guess. I'm
Yeah.
gonna follow it up with another question, or a question from Joel that asks about if a newspaper is no longer in business, do you think that obituaries and death notices will be on microfiche, or I guess microfilm of any kind?
Yeah, if it's an older newspaper, then like the Houston Post is no longer in business. The library, the Houston Public Library, had collected the Houston Post from when it started up till when it finished, and they microfilmed it.
Mhm.
So yes, a lot of older newspapers are they've been saved by an entity like a historical society or a library. And in the last, well, since I got my degree, so since 1997, most older newspapers or most newspapers have been microfilmed. So you can, so if it does not exist anymore as a business, then it may be microfilmed. Now, that does depend on them having managed to get every issue. Sometimes you get uh, where they, for some reason, they didn't have, a month of the newspaper or
Mhm.
a couple of years, or you only get a few, and it could be that you had your normal fire, flood, roof leak, and it ruined the copies that they had, so they couldn't keep them, and it was before they were microfilmed.
Mhm.
So it all depends, but I would definitely look for it in to see if it's been microfilmed, and then if that microfilm has been digitized.
Okay. I just want to remind everybody this is the last chance to get questions in. We're just about done here. Catherine has another question for you, Irene.
Mhm.
It says when the newspapers, I guess, list long pages of people who have died during an event, for example, the COVID-19 victims in the last year, is there a name for that list? What would that list be called? Is there any kind of a term for that? Do you know?
That would probably be considered a necrology.
Okay.
Because it's just a straight list of those who died, and that there's something that they all have in common.
Tie them
So they
together.
all
Yeah.
died in a particular place. They died because of a certain accident, a plane crash or whatever. They died because of COVID.
Right.
They died. They're listed because they were all priests, and it's in a Catholic church newsletter or
Hmm.
newspaper. So I
Hmm.
would go with necrology.
Necrology for 10. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Um, I did want to just add one thing because we had talked about obituaries a couple times when you were putting this together.
Mhm.
I don't know if I shared this with you, but I worked for a newspaper for a while, and sometimes I was handed the information that came in from the uh, funeral homes or sometimes from the retirement homes of people had purchased or perished or died in the last week or so. And lots of times it would just be a form with listing of this is person was born on this day and died this day. Uh, you know, this was their spouse is alive or not alive. And so lots of times the basic obits are just written by, it could be newspaper staffers from whatever sheets they get from the funeral home. Um, and so unfortunately, a lot of them are written by people that don't know the person they're writing about. And sometimes they're even having to decipher handwriting of somebody else who probably didn't know the person they're writing about. So uh, like you said, they're very useful bits of information in there, but you have to be very careful with taking it all as 100%
Mhm.
true. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
and when you get it like that, you have the person from the funeral home who wrote it, who may misspell the stuff, and then you have the person from the newspaper who might add their own misspellings or misquote about something. And so,
Hmm.
yeah, you have to look at it and compare it to everything else that you have.
Yeah. Yeah. use it as a starting point rather than,
Mhm.
yeah. Okay, well, that's all I have. That's all the questions I have for you. I'll
Okay.
turn it back over to Sue. Thank you.
Well, Irene, thank you once again, and I would like to remind everybody about our upcoming programming. Feel free to go ahead and register for anything that we have and enjoy our programming. Librarian is doing some great programming setups for, well, we've got the rest of October and November and then towards next year. So by all means, we would love to have you join us anytime you can. And you just go to houstonlibrary.org, click on events and sign up. And Irene, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge once again with the crowd. And thank you all for coming, and happy Family History Month. Take care, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.